Hi, I'm Len McDonald. It's Thursday, January 6th, 2022, and this is episode 1 of the Week 45 podcast. Back in late 2014, my son Pete and I decided to go on a road trip. He was heading off to Victoria, BC to go out to work, and we decided to turn it into a bit of a father and son road trip. So late December 2014, we left Antigonish and we headed south of the border. We drove through the New England states, through Pennsylvania. We stopped in Nashville. We spent a memorable New Year's Eve in New Orleans. We had a car breakdown in Beaumont, Texas. We stopped at Austin, the home of Austin City Limits. And then we ran into our first snag of the trip. Pete, any comments just as we launch episode 1 of the Week 45 podcast?
Well, I'd like to say that this first story is very clear in my memory. I think it's a good story about taking things for granted and getting a little too complacent when you're in the groove of a road trip.
Great. Well, look, why don't I just jump into the story? This is from the book that I published back in 2015 called Tales, Trails, and Tunes. And we'll just chronicle the events of that particular day. And Pete, feel free to jump in any time that you're so moved. So this particular story is called No Fueling Around. When taking a long road trip, some careful planning is required. Once the destination has been established and the route chosen, there are many other considerations. How many miles a day will you drive? What will the budget be for food, lodging, and fuel? What are the must-see sights? And when will you put the hammer down and put on some major miles? Traveling in the United States is a straight-ahead proposition. It's hard to go more than 20 miles without seeing a sign for hotels and gas stations. And of course, the Golden Arches are as plentiful and ubiquitous as our own Tim Horton coffee shops up north. On a recent transcontinental journey covering close to 10,000 kilometers, my son Peter and I spent most of the journey south of the border. We witnessed some extraordinary music in both Nashville and New Orleans and sampled the vast array of cuisine available as we passed from one state to the next. One thing veteran road warriors know is always keep your gas tank as close to full as possible. Virtually every time we stopped, we topped off the tank with some of the cheapest gas you can imagine. There was one exception, Texas. The Lone Star State is huge, and the landscape is dotted with plenty of exits to service areas. At one of our pit stops, we decided to take a pass on gasoline. Prices can fluctuate wildly from one town to town, and even within towns. Gasoline in the U.S. is not as highly regulated as it is in Canada. Seeing that we had 250 kilometers, or 160 miles, left in the tank, and with gas a bit higher in price than the last time we fueled, we hit the road. This particular stretch of Texas was barren, to say the least. The miles crept by, and we started to pay closer attention to our ever-dwindling supply of petrol. With just 15 kilometers remaining before we would run out, we heaved a great sigh of relief as we saw an exit ahead with the familiar Exxon logo on the sign. We were in the middle of nowhere. Actually, nowhere turned out to be Bakersfield. Population 2, the service station owner and his wife. There were about a dozen vehicles in the lineup, which seemed a bit odd, and then we noticed yellow plastic bags covering the pumps with the words "No gas available" emblazoned for all to see. A serious ice storm a few days prior had caused widespread fuel shortages in the region. We were in the desert with no gas. I looked around the sky to see if I could spot any vultures. It quickly became apparent that we were all in a bind when we found out that a fresh shipment of gas would not arrive until noon the following day. The mood was somber, to be sure. The only bright spot was the fact that there was cellular service. People were frantically calling AAA. We pulled our car across the street onto a patch of ground and assessed the situation. From our vantage point, the good news was that we didn't have a strict timetable, and other than being inconvenienced, it wouldn't be the end of the world to spend a night in the desert. Also, because we were intrepid travelers, we were well equipped to withstand adversity. We had lots of water on board, along with a cooler full of snacks and fresh fruit. Like Boy Scouts, who were always prepared, we had 4 bottles of ice-cold Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. I had this vision of a midnight auction, with each bottle fetching $20. We also had a couple of guitars. I wondered how many folks would be able to chime in on a chorus to Song for the Myra. I placed a call to CAA and explained our predicament. A calm voice on the other end assured me that one way or another, delivery of fuel or a tow, we would not spend a night under the stars. Part of me was disappointed as I pondered the story that could have come out of our predicament. As we waited for a call back from CAA, a half-ton truck pulled up, and out strode 2 Good Samaritans in the guise of cowboys. In the back of their truck were several jugs of gasoline, which they promptly dispersed to the anxious throng. We held back knowing that our fate was secure thanks to CAA. They distributed enough fuel for everyone to make it to a service station in a town 17 miles away. They had 1 gallon left when we got to the head of the line, which we hastily purchased even though they didn't request any money. We headed for McCamey, reputedly the wind energy capital of Texas, population 189. And there was lots of gas to be had. We filled up the car and headed down the road towards El Paso. Too bad we missed the desert tailgate party. Oh well, perhaps we'll find Marty Robbins tuning up in a Rosa's Cantina. Abilene, Abilene, prettiest town that I've ever seen. Women there. So Pete, just going back to that day, any of your own personal reflections? What do you remember most about that day?
Well, I remember a ton of gas stations, one after the other, often right across the highway from each other, competing in prices, and there was no thought that ever crossed my mind that they would ever run out. I mean, it was always 10 minutes down the road, another gas station, another gas station, another gas station. But suddenly, we just realized that we'd been driving for a while, and I started to get nervous because I didn't see a sign for any exit. We didn't see anything. So there was a feeling of impending doom, I think.
Unease.
Unease, yeah, on some level. And just seeing the exit when we were almost the gas light was on, and seeing that exit was a huge relief, followed by dismay as we realized that, like a few of the other people there, we had pulled in at the end of our tank and there's no gas. But I do remember, dread, then relief, then dread again, and then relief, kind of knowing that, okay, well, if it's only going to be one night, we can probably get through it,
Yeah. And I guess it's pretty common with anybody who has driven anywhere, keeping the eye on the fuel tank, whether it's driving through rural Nova Scotia or driving across Canada or down in the States, is that, being conscious of your fuel is always kind of important, but especially on a long road trip. And, we were, as I said in the story, we were veterans. I mean, every 2 hours, we generally took turns driving, and at that point we would stop at a gas station to gas up. So
yeah,
it was it was pretty bizarre. I mean, you're in Texas, a state that's known for oil, right?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you're driving through the desert, on a horse with no name, right?
That's right. Just the landscape out there too. I mean, it's not like you're getting stranded in a place with lots of fresh running water and streams and trees and shelter. I mean, this is wide open desert, so the thought of breaking down on the side of the road and not seeing anyone for a while, just the visuals that you get when you're driving across that part of the country, combined with the feeling of we're running out of gas, gives you this real feeling, of uh-oh.
Yeah, we're in shit.
Yeah, yeah. I will say one other thing that I remember is I was a little concerned that we only had 4 beer, because if we were going to have to stay there for the whole night with all these people and get out the guitars, I mean, you got to stretch those 4 beer out pretty thin.
No question about it. I know in the intro to the story, I talked about a few of the other places on our trip, and I think maybe we'll just take a little diversion here and go backwards instead of forward, and just a few comments about that you might have of Nashville. And of course we stopped at Roanoke for a bit. And New Year's Eve in New Orleans, and the broken down car in Beaumont. Now I don't want to get too far off topic, but just sort of generally that part of the trip.
First of all, I remember I was looking for a lens for my camera at the time, so we were stopping in at different cities and looking around for that. And I remember Roanoke being one of the first that we stopped, and we went to a great restaurant that night. I remember that much.
Do you remember what kind of food we had that night?
I believe it was Mexican, wasn't it?
It was Mexican.
Yeah.
And a friend from Antigonish, whose father lived in Roanoke, recommended this restaurant, and it did not disappoint.
Okay. And then Nashville, of course, was amazing. I do remember getting finding the lens, finding the camera shop online and going, okay, and calling them. They do have this very specific camera lens that I wanted. We walked as the crow flies towards this place, and we ended up in a back alley kind of area of Nashville, and there was like a gang of guys, and I just got this vibe that, we were pretty Canadian and pretty clean cut, and I don't know how much cash we were carrying on us or whatnot, but I had a little bit of a feeling of, okay, if we're going to be wandering around in cities we don't know, you might want to stick to the main drag. Yeah.
And I remember also in Nashville that the Bluebird Cafe, we took a little drive over to the Bluebird Cafe. And Peter, maybe you can fill people in why that's sort of a landmark in Nashville.
Well, I mean, it's an iconic music venue where a lot of historical concerts have gone on. And to this day, it's still a place where you'll catch some of the biggest names in country music and otherwise in other genres show up and put on shows. It's, from my knowledge, largely unchanged over time. They've kept the same aesthetic. It's in a little strip mall. It's very unassuming for such an iconic place that you hear about. I remember pulling up and thinking, wow, really? This is pretty underwhelming, like just visually.
Absolutely. I remember that well. I remember there was a couple of gals took our pictures there standing at the locked door. Mm-hmm. But yeah, very, very unassuming. It's like you say, it was in a strip mall, right?
Yeah.
So the other part, and it's very possible that we may do a separate story on this, but we arrived in New Orleans on New Year's Eve, and the following day there was a college football semifinal, and there was 100,000 extra people in the city to go to the football game. So I remember going down to the French Quarter that afternoon, and the throngs of people was just amazing. Mm-hmm. And then later that night, of course, we went back to see, to ring in the new year. And I can just remember that being such a crazy, crazy, crazy night.
Yeah, on Bourbon Street. I mean, it was an intense situation there. I mean, you're allowed to carry your beer around on the street, and I mean, it was just trying to protect yourself and shouldering your way through crowds. And I mean, the spirit was very high, and it was very fun to be down there, and just the stimulus coming at you from every possible angle. And I also remember returning to the house we were staying at that night, which was in a neighborhood a little set back from the main city, and they started setting off fireworks in the neighborhood sometime around midnight or close to it, or maybe a little after, and they didn't stop for hours and hours. And in the morning, you went out, and it looked like the apocalypse. There was shrapnel and burning embers and everything. They literally just let loose
Pete, it's funny. It reminds me of when I was in India. There's a festival. It's called Diwali. It's a festival of lights, and it reminded me the very same thing. The firecrackers, and this is in a city of 10 million people, and when the firecrackers started, like early evening, and went through till the next day, again, it looked like Armageddon. I mean, there was still a lot of smoke in the air, a lot of pollution, and of course the ground was littered with, explosives.
Yeah. I remember it was just total chaos, and it went on so late. I'm like, well, this is America, the land of the free, the land of the fireworks, the land of the next day. It looking like total chaos.
Yeah, and speaking of the next day, I remember we got on the road and we drove through the bayous, and that was a really amazing experience for me anyway. I mean, it's basically swamp, and how they ever managed to build a 4-lane highway through hundreds of kilometers of swamp was really something else.
Yeah. Well, thinking of getting stranded in Texas is one thing. Thinking of getting stranded on those above swamp highways in Louisiana is another, because I mean, literally, they put concrete pillars coming straight out of the water. The trees are below the level of the highway, and you're basically just driving across miles and miles and miles and miles and miles of swamp. So if you broke down on that highway, you can't even walk anywhere except farther down the road.
And I suspect that there were creatures living in those in the bayous as well.
Yeah, well, it's either going to be a rattlesnake in Texas or an alligator in the swamp, but I'd prefer to not run into either of them.
So, Pete, as we were getting near the border of Texas, by the way, I think we both learned a lot of geography in terms of where things are in the southern United States.
Yeah,
looking
for sure.
At the states. But you might want to just chirp in with our car story.
Yeah. Coming from the border of Louisiana into Texas, there's a town called Beaumont, probably within 25 miles of the border, if I remember.
Yeah.
And we started hearing a strange noise. Now I'm trying to remember what the actual issue ended up being.
It was something in the rear end behind sort of the back tire.
It was a strut or something like that.
A strut, yeah, I think it was a strut.
Yeah, so it started rattling pretty bad to the point where, we probably shouldn't keep driving unless we address this. Yeah, we pulled into Beaumont, Texas, and the first shop that we found open that day, because it was the day after New Year's. So that was
actually it was New Year's Day.
Oh, it was New Year's Day.
It was actually New Year's Day. And actually, Peter, I remember before we got to Beaumont, we pulled off, when we crossed the border, we pulled into the first rest area, and you got out to kind of take a look and see if you could see what was going on. And I remember making a couple of phone calls to some backyard mechanics back home, who basically we kind of described what it was, and both of them agreed we definitely shouldn't be driving a whole lot further.
Yeah, Uncle Ramey was one of the guys we called. He advised that we get it looked at by a professional.
Yeah,
I remember we found a place that was open, and the guy was super nice, super accommodating. He had to order in a part from Houston, so we had to stay overnight. But he was on top of it, friendly guy, got it done real as quick as possible. We were back on our way. So.
Yeah, so that was, we spent a couple of days there, and I do remember we went to Floyd's restaurant, and I hadn't had a lot of jambalaya in my life, but that was simply amazing, the food.
All along this trip, some of the best memories were some of those restaurants we went to and stuff. But as they say, everything's bigger in Texas, and the food is no exception.
Yeah. So anyway, that's sort of a little chronicle of events leading up to our fuel shortage in Western Texas. And like I say, I still have a little tinge of regret that we didn't get stuck there that night, because it would have been really interesting to see with the collection of people who were there, what would have transpired. And Peter, what we may have found out is that, getting back to your beer theme, there may have been somebody who had a bigger supply of beer than us. So don't ever.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And I had that same thought. But as it goes, you kind of roll with it on these trips. The fact that we got going pretty quickly because of those nice cowboys that came along with the gas just meant that the next few days turned out the way they did, and we ended up in the places that we ended up, and there's more stories that came from that. So, you just kind of go with the flow.
Yeah, you're right, and the benefit that we had, that we weren't on a strict timetable. You didn't have to be in Victoria for a certain time, and you're not traveling with kids or babies and stuff like that, or pets or whatever. So I mean, it's just basically the two of us, and like you say, you gotta learn to roll with it. The other thing that I found surprising about the gas shortage was an ice storm in Texas. Like, I never ever could have imagined an ice storm. And I do remember the next day traveling west towards El Paso, that a lot of places, rest areas and service stations and restaurants were still closed because of that ice storm.
That's right.
Actually, I think that day, if I went back and looked at my journal, I think it was one of the worst meals we ever had. There was a little diner, and the food was almost inedible. But
that little Mexican place, maybe? Or,
I can't. I've chosen to forget.
Okay.
Exactly what it was, but it was bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just remember coming into El Paso. There was just something about the landscape and the visual, and knowing that the Mexican border was very, very close by. It was sort of eerie to me. The landscape and looking across, it just, for some reason, looked ominous. And maybe the motel we stayed in that night was a big, big place, and a lot of transient people there, and a lot of kind of sketchy-looking characters. And, of course, probably the other people were thinking the same thing of you and I.
Yeah, I do remember El Paso being a little notorious, too, because it's a border town, and, a lot of drama happens in those areas. And so, yeah, we just kind of hunkered down and got going pretty quick in the morning.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, so there's episode 1 of Week 45 podcast. Pete and I talked about this actually on Christmas Day. I've been writing stories for the last 10 years, twice a week, and some of you have been crazy enough to read every single one of them. And just for variety, we were talking about, podcasts, and Pete is a sort of an aficionado of podcasts, and I haven't really listened to many. So this idea kind of got hatched over steak, shrimp, and red wine about doing this type of thing. And so, just for variety, we're going to just see where the road takes us. There's lots of other travel stories as well. As many of you know, I spent 6 months in India. I've walked across Spain, and I've recently done a 2.5-year stint up in the Arctic in an Inuit community. So there's tons of story and tons of material, and I guess at the end of the day, it's all about sharing. One of the comments that I get quite regularly from people who read my material is that they're sort of living vicariously through me. Not everybody is going to go to India, or not many people are going to end up, in the Arctic, or are crazy enough to walk across Spain. Mm-hmm. But people can see another part of the world sort of through your eyes and through your storytelling.
Yeah. There's a lot of stories that you have that involve trials and tribulations that I'm sure people would be glad that they're sitting at home listening to the story rather than living it.
Yeah, there's no question about that. But I think you'll concur, because you like to be on the road. Is that travel's a great education. I mean, you get to see other parts of the world. You get to meet all kinds of interesting people, and you sample all kinds of different food. To me, it's just one of the great thrills in life to be able to travel.
I couldn't agree more.
Okay, guys, so there you have it. Thank you for tuning in. We decided when we were going to do this that this was not going to be slick or polished, and we haven't disappointed. It's raw, and you have it the way it came off the top of our heads. So thanks for joining in, and have a great day. Can you imagine a piece of the universe more fit for princes and kings? I'll trade you 10 of your cities for Marion Bridge and the pleasure it brings.